Who was O.J. Simpson? Well, who doesn't know who O.J. Simpson is or who hasn't heard of O.J. Simpson? Orenthal James Simpson, an All-American football player. He played for the University of Southern California, USC. He was a Heisman Trophy winner, and that's one of the most coveted, prestigious awards in football, meaning he was the Player of the Year that year. That was in 1968. He was also at USC known as a member of the world-setting 440-yard relay team. So he was fast. He was an incredible athlete. They like to call him Juice. And I didn't know this not only because of how fast he was, but also because of his initials standing for orange juice, OJ. So that's how he got to be known as OJ. He went on to really continue his illustrious career as a prominent athlete when he was the number one draft pick of the American Football League Buffalo Bills in 1969. A little bit later on, he then was with the San Francisco 49ers in the NFL. Overall, he played 11 seasons with the NFL. 5 years later, he married the beautiful, model, gorgeous Nicole Brown. She's petite. She's got blonde hair. She's got these delicate features. She's truly someone, when you see in pictures, you think, oh, clearly a model. She's just gorgeous. They had 2 children, also beautiful. If you see a picture of the family, it's one of those families you see and say, wow, what a great looking family. Justin and Sydney were their 2 children. The nation loves still O.J. Simpson. I best remember watching, when I was little, a Hertz TV commercial. This was for the Hertz rent-a-car, where he's running through the airport. He was a spokesperson, not just for Hertz, but for many others as well. He acted. He was in different films. You may remember The Towering Inferno. He was in the comedies The Naked Gun movies. He was on different TV shows. I remember watching specifically In the Heat of the Night. He was in those TV shows. He was a sports commentator. He had it all. He was handsome, athletic, very charismatic. People loved O.J. Simpson. People still love O.J. Simpson. So the question becomes, how did this man, rich, famous, popular, loved by an entire nation, how did he get so caught up in his own wrath that he ended up charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her friend? The sin, wrath. Wrath is defined as the feeling of hatred and the desire for revenge. This is the why behind the alleged crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, a trial attorney, I would say almost every case that I've dealt with over the years intersects with one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, lust, wrath, envy, gluttony, sloth. These are the opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues. Temptations that, when taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the trial of O.J. Simpson and how the deadly sin of wrath turned a well-loved superstar into a criminal defendant fighting for his life, accused of a very ugly double murder. A little later, I'll be joined by Donte Mills in our breakdown segment, and we go deep on the how and the why of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, case of the 20th century. That trial still lives on today. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. On the night of June 12th of 1994, Simpson's ex-wife Nicole Brown and her friend Ronald Goldman were murdered outside of her own condominium in Los Angeles, California. The crime scene was really unspeakably gruesome. Nicole had been stabbed 7 times with a knife. The cut on her neck was so deep that she was almost decapitated. Ron Goldman was stabbed 25 times, blood everywhere. A horrible crime scene. O.J. Simpson very quickly became the prime suspect. Here are some of the reasons that he was the prime suspect. Let's start with blood. Blood from the crime scene was found in his car and his home. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood found at the crime scene that didn't belong to Nicole or Ronald was that of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was unaccounted for more than 1 hour on the night of the murders. That was reason number 2. He was so quickly considered a suspect. Number 3, he had a history of violence against Nicole, and friends said that he was vengeful as reconciliation attempts between Simpson and Nicole weren't working. So O.J. was charged with the murders. But instead of surrendering to the police when he was told these charges existed and you can have an attorney help you surrender, instead of that, on June 17th, Simpson hid in the back of a white Bronco driven by his friend A.C. Cowlings. You will remember this. If not, all you have to do is Google white Ford Bronco. You will see YouTube videos of the white Ford Bronco driving down the interstate in L.A. After being told that during that chase, Simpson had a gun to his own head, law enforcement officers chose to follow the vehicle at low speeds. This lasted for more than 1 hour. So you can see the white Bronco and then law enforcement following at a slow speed. This attempted escape by O.J. Simpson was filmed nationally. It was seen by an estimated 95 million viewers. Hundreds of Simpson's fans lined the street as he drove by. Again, he was beloved by all. They're cheering him on the sides of the streets as he's driving down the interstate. The chase did eventually end at Simpson's home in Brentwood, California, and he was arrested and placed into police custody. As happens in criminal trials, the next step, he was formally arraigned on July 22nd of 1994. He did enter a plea of not guilty. That next year, about 6 months later, on January 24th of 1995, the trial began before the Honorable Judge Lance Ito, whose decision to allow television coverage of the trial was controversial, and he faced a lot of criticism for the trial for a couple of things. Number one, he seemingly enjoyed the press, and number two, for allowing too many sidebars and recesses during the trial. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, 2 lead prosecutors handled the case against O.J. Simpson. You've probably heard of them, Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. They leaned into the domestic violence that had occurred before and after the 1992 divorce. Of course, they said it was the motive for the murders. The attorneys representing Simpson, very well known in their own right, but together for this trial, they were known as the Dream Team. Criminal defense attorneys you've heard of, including F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, Alan Dershowitz, Robert Kardashian. Who hasn't heard of him? The father of the Kardashian girls. Also, Robert Kardashian was a good friend of O.J. Simpson's. Now, later on, Johnny Cochran became part of the Dream Team, and he became the defense's lead attorney. The Simpson defense was based largely on the grounds that, number one, evidence had been mishandled, and that many members of the Los Angeles Police Department were racist. And in particular, Mark Furman, a witness, a detective, he allegedly found a bloody leather glove at Simpson's home. But the defense argued that that glove couldn't have even belonged to Simpson because it appeared too small for his hand when he actually tried it on in court during trial in front of that jury. In addition to the glove, there was other evidence that the defense leaned in and said had been planted to frame Simpson because they were racist. The trial lasted more than 8 months with 150 witnesses. O.J. Simpson, he did not testify. He did not speak to the jury. He sat quietly. Millions watched television coverage of this entire trial. And major figures involved in the case, including Mark Fuhrman, became instant celebrities, whether loved or hated, as a result of being seen during this trial. On October 2nd of 1995, the jury finally began deliberating. Unbelievably, they reached a verdict in less than 4 hours. 8 months of trial, less than 4 hours, they reached a verdict. Judge Ito delayed the verdict until the next day, the following day. So on October 3rd, the jury came out. The verdict was read. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. O.J. has always maintained his innocence. But the story doesn't end there, because although he was acquitted on these murder charges, he was sued by the victims' families for wrongful death. Now, that's a civil trial. It followed the criminal trial, and less than 4 months later, in the civil case, the jury found him responsible for those deaths, and they awarded the victims' families, the family of Nicole Brown as well as the family of Ronald Goldman, they awarded those families $33.5 million in damages. Much of that's not been collected, but that was the award in the civil case. Now, I would suggest that wrath may have continued to affect his desire for revenge, O.J.'s behaviors, because his legal troubles weren't over. In September of 2007, Simpson led a group of men to a Las Vegas hotel and casino to try to steal what he claims rightfully belonged to him, sports memorabilia. He did so at gunpoint. As a result, Simpson was charged with a number of felony counts, including kidnapping and armed robbery. A jury did find him guilty of botched robbery, and he was sentenced in that case for up to 33 years in prison. O.J. served a total of 9 years on that conviction, and he then returned to his home in Las Vegas. On April 10th of this year, 2024, O.J. Simpson passed away in Las Vegas at his home from prostate cancer. He was 76 years old. With me today is Donte Mills, a practicing trial attorney and a law professor that teaches trial advocacy. I've been on with you a lot, Donte, and I always value and appreciate your knowledge, not just of the intricacies of trial skills, but really the strategy behind it, the motive, all of those pieces. So I want to tell you a little bit about my thoughts on O.J. Simpson and then talk about this with you. I mean, this was the trial of the century. His murder trial was televised. It became a national obsession. The media was there for every moment. And the moment that Simpson was found not guilty by the jury, this was one of the most watched live events in television history, even today. And the trial also, I think, changed the way that court cases are covered. What really stood out to me was not just the forensics, but also the focus on the motive. It was really, I thought, believable what the state put forward. The jury didn't believe it. He's not guilty, but the motive, the wrath of O.J., the domestic violence history, the strategy that the state used to say, hey, he was so vengeful, he was so full of anger, and he had this desire for revenge because he caught Nicole Simpson with a friend, Ronald Goldman, but this caused him to murder them. At least that's what the state argue. And, this verdict divided the country. Many still think that O.J. Simpson did it, that he murdered these two people. So why does the motive sound so convincing when we talk about it and people say, oh, he's guilty, but it wasn't convincing for the jury? Donte, let's start there. Not guilty. What was your reaction when you saw that verdict?
I was sitting in high school in a classroom, and as you spoke about, the judge in this case got the verdict the day before, but it was later in the day, and he knew that this was an event. So he scheduled the verdict to be read the next day. We were in class, and the teacher wheeled in a television on one of those wheelie carts, and we all watched the verdict in class, and everybody was just surprised, shocked, and complete. It was just chaos after the verdict was read. I'll never forget that moment for a couple of reasons. One, I always wanted to be a lawyer, but it was then that I understood. And I think this goes into why covering cases changed. That's when I really understood the importance of controlling the narrative. And if anybody's ever taken my class at Temple, my child advocacy class, that's what I lead with, controlling the narrative. You get to tell the jury what's important. And if you do that better than your adversary, you win. If you say, this is what the case is about, and you make that something that you can't be wrong on, and the jury buys into that, you win. And that's what happened here. And that's why covering cases changed, because it went from people thinking that, oh, this is all legal jargon, and they talk about things in court that I don't understand, to just the basics of two stories being told. There were two sides who bought into each story. So you talked about the motive aspect that the prosecutors brought up, where there was jealousy, there was rage. He caught Nicole Brown with a male that was her friend, but he thought it was more. And they really sold that story, and half the country believed it. The other story was, this is all fabricated because there's racism in the police department, and they're simply out to get OJ because of who he is. And the other half of the country believed that story. And it came down to what story led the way. And ultimately, I think Johnny Cochran and his team did a phenomenal job of convincing everyone of one simple fact. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Did that win the trial? I mean,
that won the trial.
When that happened, I remember I was watching it wide-eyed, and I thought to myself, what are you doing? What are you doing? Certainly you realize, prosecution, that he could try on the glove. Certainly there are arguments like the blood could have caused the glove to be smaller. I mean, there are lots of different, but all I could think was, oh my gosh, they're going to win. They have to win. Look what they just did. They showed the glove didn't fit his hand. And they did, through testimony, show things like racism, right? The things that were said and done. I
think that was important.
Yes.
Because it gave the opportunity for someone to believe there was a reason and a purpose why O.J. Simpson was set up. So that gave people, if they wanted to believe he was set up, that gave them a reason to believe it. But ultimately, what Johnny Cochran did is he controlled the narrative. He said, the most important fact in this case is whether or not this glove fits. And if it doesn't, you cannot find him guilty. And the jury bought into that being the most important fact of the case. And when he got up there and tried the glove on and struggled and look, you just knew what was going to happen. They allowed Johnny Cochran to take over that case and make it about one fact that he knew he had control over. And that is really what it sucked me into law, and I've never looked back since. I'll tell you a quick story. I met Johnny Cochran when I was in law school. He was at a book signing, and I had tore my ligament in my leg at the time, so I was on crutches. I took the bus because I couldn't drive. I go to the book signing. He sees me on crutches, and he's like, you did a lot to get here. So I started telling my story. I'm in law school, and he really became interested. We sat and talked for 2 hours after the book signing, and he talked to me about the case. He talked to me about how to approach the practice of law. He signed the book for me and gave me a personal note. I'll never forget that moment, because he really taught me that you have the opportunity to control any situation, any narrative by telling the jury what's important and making sure that you tell them something that you can't lose on and you can win the case.
Okay, I just have to share with everybody listening and watching. I had no idea of that story. When I asked you to be on, I knew in my mind I wanted you to do O.J. Simpson with me because of your knowledge of trial skills and strategy and the narrative. I had no idea that you had met him. I mean, that's a remarkable story because
Well,
those
it's
are the kind of
combined. I think
mentors.
I do that because I did meet him and had that conversation where he truly told me the approach is up to you. Both sides have the same facts. You decide what's important. The jury, they don't know. And when you do jury selection, a lot of people are apprehensive. I don't know the law. I don't know if I want that responsibility because I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And you
Right.
tell them, no, you're going to use common sense, but I'm going to tell you what's important. And if you do that better than the other side, you win. That's what it comes
The,
down to.
you're right. Two questions. Do you think that they had access to the evidence in a way that O.J. Simpson could have tried that glove on before? Do you think O.J. Simpson knew it wouldn't fit and said, let me try it on, counselor, it's not going to fit? Or do you think they just lucked into the fact it actually didn't fit? Because that was the part that I got stuck on.
I believe, and this is separate from my conversation with Johnny Cochran. This did not, we did not get into this detail, and I wouldn't ask him because who knows? I
Right.
believe there was no way that that glove was going to fit. Even if it was oversized, he would have struggled to get it on. And it was no way he was going to walk up there in the middle of that courtroom and slide that glove on perfectly. It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So whether he expanded his hand, no matter what he did, they had control of the evidence and of that storyline, and they weren't going to let it get away from him. So whether he tried the glove on before or not, whether the glove was 8 sizes too big, I guarantee you that the outcome was going to be the same. It wasn't going to fit when he put it on.
The glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And that's what the jury did. So were they out lawyered? Because this dream team, I remember we would go to San Francisco and travel every summer. My father was a college professor. And in doing that, I remember I was probably 6 or 7. And he said, oh, I want to take you by this storefront window. And I thought, that's weird. But he did. And it was F. Lee Bailey's office, one of. And he said, this is the best criminal defense attorney you'll ever hear of. And this was way before OJ. It was when I was really young. And he told me all about this man. And my family are not a family of lawyers. So it was really a little odd to me, right, that he was telling me this story and showing me this office. So I knew of this man's name in relation to being one of the best criminal defense attorneys for years before this case ever came along. But when you hear the names in the dream team, everybody's heard of these lawyers, and they're up against 2 prosecutors. Even if seasoned, that's a lot more lawyers on the defense side. Were they strictly out-lawyered the state?
They were outlawyered because one of the things that the state often does, and I take advantage of this whenever I can, is they get into the weeds too much and they don't see the bigger picture. And they did that here. The state had the opportunity. They had motive, right? This is a scorned husband, a jealous husband, went into rage. They had blood at his house from the crime scene, things like that, that if you just focus on that, and if they counter that glove doesn't fit with who cares? What difference does that make? How does blood from a crime scene get into someone's house that did not commit the crime? It's impossible, right? If you focus on things like that, then they could have won this case. But they were out lawyered because they did not control the narrative. They went too much in the weeds and got on the defensive about Mark Furman and some of the racism. Like some of that stuff, they should have said it doesn't make a difference. Because no matter how racist you are, you can't change the fact that this blood from the crime scene was there and point us to those things. So I do think they were out lawyered. I think it was probably daunting for them to go up against this group. And you can see some, I've watched this trial a lot. You can see some nervousness on their faces and just their exchanges, even during some of the objections and things like that. But I do believe that they were out lawyered, and it shows that it makes a difference what lawyer you have and the strategy that those lawyers use. It's not just, we show up at court and the law speaks for itself. No, advocacy makes a difference.
And the advocacy and learning how to best advocate makes a difference because you can try 100 cases. I always look at what I do and try to do better. I try to figure out what needs to change. I like taking classes about how can this be done differently? How can it be done better? Give me feedback. And I believe, and I know you teach this, so obviously you believe it too, Donte, that it's not enough to say, I've tried 100 trials. You've got to be able to think on your feet, to understand how to pivot and really fight with the gloves off if the other side takes control of the narrative. And I do think, and I'm not criticizing any one attorney, I'm saying if you don't come back and say what you said, which is, who cares about the glove? It's not relevant. Yeah, these are horrible statements by police officers within the department, but they couldn't have planted the evidence because if you fight back with those things, I think that makes a difference. Do you teach lawyers to learn how to fight back correctly within the rules of evidence, within court decorum? But you got to keep fighting for your client, whether it's the state or the defense. And I feel like in this case, it was a little bit like, uh-oh, they just won the case, and everybody sits down.
Yes, and I don't teach them to fight back. I'm going to clarify this. It's not a fight back. What I teach them is to be yourself, first of all. You know what got you here and your traits that you're good at. You got to know your strengths and weaknesses. But once you decide how to control that narrative, you never give that up. So it's not a fight back because you're not accepting what their narrative is. That's where you start losing because now you're chasing their narrative and they've won. So I would have never even accepted the fact that the glove was important. So it's not accepting their narrative and then trying to challenge that. It's sticking to yours and making sure that you are more persuasive in your narrative and getting the jury to ignore or not consider what theirs is at all, as opposed to dropping what you're doing and now picking up their fight and trying to win their fight. Because if they're a good attorney, they're going to pick a fight they can't lose. They couldn't lose if you accepted that the case was about this glove. You lost already. There was no way to combat that. You have to stick with your fight and say, I know they're saying, but that doesn't make a difference. And that's not really fighting back. That's staying strong with your arguments and making sure that the jury believes that your argument is the most important in the case.
That's a good point. You're defending your position, a better way to say it, and that all makes good sense. Let's talk a little then about how important the motive is, because cases are won and lost on the motive alone. If you can't tell a jury as a state, as a prosecution, this is why we think this person did it, sometimes juries, I find, don't convict. They're going to say, well, we don't know. That doesn't make sense. Why would they ever do that? We're not going to find, even if there's forensic evidence, even if there are phone records, it doesn't matter because we can't figure out why they would ever do that. So if we look at the hatred OJ must have felt when he sees his wife with Ronald Goldman, according to the state, and he has a desire for revenge because he's angry. And so his wrath gets carried away. I mean, I stand by with the domestic violence that these two, the history of domestic violence between these two at the hands of OJ Simpson. I think the motive was right, really, truly, for a prosecution to win this case. How important is that motive?
It depends on if you believe that will carry the day. And again, if you're talking about controlling the narrative, the motive can be important if you want it to be. Or if you don't have a strong motive, then you tell the jury that that's not important, right? And you focus on what is important. In this case, I do believe if the prosecution decided that we're going to make motive carry the day, I think they could have done it because there was a history of domestic violence. And this was a fresh situation where it kind of made sense that this was a rage killing because of the 25 stab wounds, and Nicole Brown was stabbed with 12 times and almost decapitated. So all of that fit together where you could have said, listen, we're not going to, glove or not, again, keep going back to that. We're talking about this relationship that existed that fell apart and he did not want to let it go. And he decided if he can't have her, nobody could. We know that. The evidence is here to support that. There's nobody else that could have done this. He did this trial. He did this crime because of that. And they could have pointed, the prosecution could have pointed to the motive to carry the day. But again, they did not select one thing. They were kind of bouncing all around the place,
Yeah.
and then got behind the defense and was trying to play catch up and change people's mind from the defense perspective, which, again, they never had a win if they were going to go that route. But motive can carry the day in cases if it's strong enough for you to believe that you can convince a jury on that. Then you tell a jury, the most important thing here is why it was done. Here's why it was done. That's why they're guilty. The end.
And this, to me, is a case that you can build a trial advocacy course around, beginning to end, from the openings to the closings. From the judge, he was criticized because of how many sidebars there were, and there were a lot of them, and that he loved the press, all the criticism of that. But really, strategically, who does that advantage? Who does that disadvantage to have that many sidebars? And you and I both know, if you have a sidebar when the other side's in a flow and really scoring a lot of points, what does that do? It throws them off their game potentially. So there's a lot of strategy around all of that. What other things, if any, stood out to you, Donte, that as you watched this unfold and became a trial lawyer, in part after talking to one of these lawyers, what else sticks out to you about this trial? Again, he was acquitted. We know that, but what a trial.
The ebbs and flows of it. I mean, I think in the beginning, the prosecution came off strong. They were confident, but you could see them get rattled and nervous as this went on. And you saw kind of the ebbs and flows of this trial. And there was a point almost where you saw the prosecution feel like they were going to lose. And some of the objections that started to come out, you see that the defense were really picking on them. We talk about the strategy in objections, interrupting their flow, some speaking objections where Johnny Cochran was very adamant, and some of the other attorneys there as well, just with their facial expressions. The jury reads those things. And that's something that I learned in watching this trial. And this is why I watch it often, because you learn these cues of how to connect with the jury and speak to them a lot of times without using your words, right? Or if you're using your words, with your tone, with your pitch, even in the manner you're objecting, the face that you make. If you think you want the jury to believe that the prosecution is doing something wrong, or that a witness is out of line or lying, you can make a face or body language to do that. And this was really my first exposure to that. I think it was a lot of people's first exposure to that, because they thought the courtroom was very stoic, was somewhere where everybody was buttoned up and you couldn't show any kind of emotion. But these attorneys showed emotion. And I think that carried a lot of weight here and showing the jury which way they should go. So really, this trial, what stood out to me was how open these seasoned attorneys were, how much they were themselves, and how normal they acted in certain situations, both in their responses to some of the witnesses that were speaking, and just how they carried themselves throughout this trial. There's a lot to learn here.
There's a lot to learn here. Johnny Cochran, I felt like, was a great orator because he was so natural in his own skin. He was authentic, but he had a presence. He didn't stand behind a podium. Some people are comfortable there. He talked.
Absolutely.
And he used his hands. And so you take all that away from it. What a trial. So let me ask you this, because some people who believe OJ did it and should have been convicted feel like karma caught up to him because of the subsequent criminal act that he committed and was then convicted for. Of course, that's when he went with a gun and some buddies to the Las Vegas hotel to claim what he claimed was rightfully his, sports memorabilia of his. But he was found guilty. And not only that, he was sentenced up to 33 years in prison. We know he served 9 of those years. Is that karma?
It depends on which side you were on. I tend to lead with the foundation of our principles of law here, which says if you're innocent till proven guilty.
Okay.
He was not proven guilty for this case, so I have to accept that he's innocent, right? I can look at the evidence that was a part of this case and how I would have tried it, and whether or not I think a jury would have or should have convicted him, but they didn't ultimately. And I can't be a lawyer and have respect for my profession and say this person was found not guilty, but he should be treated as if he was found guilty, or something should happen to him because he should have been found guilty. I like to say, if you're a prosecutor, your job is to prosecute the case. You have that burden. As a defense attorney, your job is to make sure that the prosecutors are doing their job. And a lot of
Hmm.
people ask me, how can you represent, whether it's a murderer or somebody like that? I'm not representing that individual. I represent the purity of our system. If I can show that the prosecution does not meet their burden, then this person should not be found guilty. So that's how I would approach this case in OJ. Whether he did it or not, I guess we'll never know. Some people say he confessed in his book, and if I did it and things like that. But I can't treat him as if he's guilty because he was found not guilty by a jury, and the prosecution did not meet their burden and did not convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt.
And it can't be used against him at subsequent trials. So, just to be clear for
Yeah,
our viewers, the fact he was tried for 2 brutal murders because he was found not guilty, that's not evidence that was used at this other unrelated trial for criminal charges. You can't do that. To your point, too, you don't want to prejudice a jury. You're not guilty, you're innocent. So, if you're innocent because you were found not guilty, then that's not going to be used against you. Donte
yeah,
Mills, I love having you on and talking about all the strategy and the insight. And what a great story. Thank you for sharing your story because that's pretty remarkable. And again, I encourage anyone and everyone to go watch clips from this trial because it is a remarkable trial
fascinating,
that I don't think will be surpassed.
fascinating. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.